Hi, I'm Gary Hess from Phase 2 Music, and I really like the sound of sustained, distorted chords with ringing notes on top. Now, in pedal design, there's a certain part of the circuit that really lets those top notes come through the mix. And it's actually the input filter. So pedals have three basic parts: an input filter, a saturation stage, and an output filter. And some pedals actually have multiples of those in the same pedal. You may actually have like 2 or 3 gain stages. But this video is going to focus upon the input filter. In my radical distortion, I have an input filter designed. You can actually see its frequency response. And a lot of that frequency of the input filter, you can see right here, is cutting those frequencies down. So to find out how much does that really contribute to the sound, what I did is I took another radical distortion pedal. This is a pre-prototype. I removed the input filter, set it really, really low, and then I also took out the bass makeup circuit. So this circuit's now response looks like this. And you can see that entire, all that low frequency is now put back in because I removed the input filter. Matter of fact, you compare the two, you see how much more low-end response this modified pedal has. Now sonically, we can compare the two and see the contribution of that filter. I'll do that now. Modified pedal. What you notice is some of those top notes, they don't seem to ring out as much. My clean sound is a Dream 65 through a Strymon Flint. I'm now going to start to explain why those high notes seem to fade away. So what I'm going to play is that with the clean sound, I'm going to go play an open E on the high E string and one on the low E string. If you play the two together, it appears like the low E string sustains a lot longer than the high E string. Now to really understand this and see the details behind it, I'm going to go to some charts. I was an engineer. I was even on a program one time that we had a saying for the program that we make charts, not parts. I made so many charts. This plot right here shows the PRS high and low E strings, and you can actually see the sustained time for each. I recorded into the Quant Asylum QA403, and I then imported those into Python so I can get better charts. So I took the data from the strings and I did some math on them in Python. I turned it into sort of an RMS envelope, and you can actually see that it now decays at a more, instead of this curve, it's more of a flat rate. It ends up that to go down 20 dB took about 3 seconds. I know the electrical engineers in the crowd are going to go, oh, but Gary, hey, that's 20 dB. That's not time constants. I got you covered. That's about 2.3 tau. Now, if I compare the two strings to each other, what you see here is that the top E string drops in volume in 3 seconds, while the low E string takes 9 seconds. So the low E string is going to sustain far longer than the high E string. And that is what we notice listening to the two strings. We'll hear that again. I'm now going to explain the effects of the longer settling time on the low strings on the distortion tone. If the low E has a lot more tone after, let's say, a quarter of a second, because he's decaying at a slower rate, it's going to be going on beyond the time of the high E string. And what that means is that he's going to overwhelm the high E string. And because the gain is so much higher, it's almost going to seem like it crowds out the high E string. Let me explain. I'm going to play a high E string, then I'm going to follow with the low E string. You're going to notice how it sort of fades into the background pretty quick. Let's go see this. Notice that once the low E string is starting to sustain a bit and the high E string is decayed beyond that point, the high E string seems to fade away and the low E strings remain. And now I'm going to play with the radical distortion with the high pass filter put back in. What you now hear is that high string seems to cut through the mix better. I'm going to play the two pedals back and forth using both high E strings and low E strings, and also high B strings and low E strings, back to back to back, so you can clearly hear the difference. High B string. high E string to low E string. You can actually hear the difference there, and this input filter really matters. As a matter of fact, pretty much all pedals have this function. My integrated overdrive and radical distortion have those, and actually I tweak the values based on what I think sounds good. Now, if you found this interesting, again, like, subscribe, share. Feel free to post comments, and I'll try to respond to them. Again, you can go to phase2music.com and buy the pedals. Links in the description below. Hey, and thanks again, and have a good time. Keep on playing.